Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to October. I don't know where you are, but it's been absolutely gorgeous here where I am in Indianapolis. So, I am back. My voice is back, hopefully feeling pretty good. So, I'm going to get started on this Promise podcast because, I'm going to start doing this every week because there's a lot of stuff I want to talk about, a lot of stuff I have to catch up on. So, today we're going to talk about the Global Slavery Index, published sometime this summer, I'm not really sure, published by the International Organization for Migration and the Walk Free Foundation, as well as the International Labor Organization, ILO. Let me see. This put out by the ILO, International Labor Organization, Walk Free Foundation, and the IOM, International Organization for Migration. The last one they put out was in 2018, reviewing 2017 data. This is in 2022, reviewing 2021 data. And so they estimate there are about 10 million more people in slavery today than there was 5 years ago. That's just too many. I mean, it doesn't take, one person is too many as far as I'm concerned. But this is what they estimate on any given day. 50 million people in situations of modern slavery, which means they're either forced to work against their will or in a marriage that they were forced into. And so this number translates roughly to nearly one of every 150 people in the world. My goodness, that's a lot of people. Well, I'm not going to get too much in the weeds of the data here or anything like that. I just want to go over some highlights. This might be boring for you. It's okay. You can skip over. I'm just going to go over highlights. But the reason why I'm going over these reports is because there's a lot of our policy, that national policy is regarded this. There's huge money. There's huge international attention that's paid to these reports. A lot of organizations will highlight and it's like, see, there's a big problem. We need to do something about it. And then they're going to have, they're going to prescribe some issues, some interventions to do with this, and they're going to highlight big issues. And it really makes I hope it'll make more sense. If it doesn't, let me know and I'll try to fix it in the future, because I realize that I understand this topic in ways different than who I hope my target audience is, which is you, the everyday person. And so what does this mean? You'll see headlines, maybe you see on the anti-trafficking organization that you're following or you're donating, and they will have had this headline in the last couple of weeks, or maybe something on CNN or Fox or BBC or wherever you get your news. They're going to have this headline. But what does it mean? I'm not going to pretend to tell you what it means. I'm just going to give you my take on what it means, and you can take that for what it's worth. So first, we have to start with definitions. What they mean by modern slavery. This is the Global Slavery Index, not the Global Trafficking in Human Beings Index. And so modern slavery, as defined for the purposes of these global estimates, is comprised of two principal components, and they break it up into forced labor and forced marriage. So both refer to situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or cannot leave because of threats, violence, deception, abuse of power, or other forms of coercion. Now, they're not referring this as human trafficking. Now, I'm not going to go in, maybe that's another podcast, how slavery and human trafficking aren't always interchangeable. Some people do, and a lot of times I refer to this, but sometimes it's not. And here they're really making a difference that there are slave-like conditions. There are slaves that wouldn't necessarily fall under the definition of human trafficking. Why? Human trafficking will fall under the umbrella of slavery. It's classified as slavery, although they don't really delineate this. This is just in my experience. This is how I'm understanding it. Trafficking in human beings or trafficking in persons or human trafficking is often described how I describe it is a geopolitical definition that's used by governments to make laws and set policy. They have to define what is human trafficking, what does that look like for the purposes of our government, for our national borders, for our citizens. Normally, it's pretty narrow, and they try to make this really narrow so that they can absolve themselves of responsibility to do something about human trafficking in their borders. And it's also because the Palermo Protocol, which is from year 2000, Palermo, Italy, where they sort of set the first international agreed upon definition of human trafficking and not modern slavery. And so that's why there is a definition of terms, and certain governments and policies and organizations do not use these interchangeably, although a lot of people like you and me do. I know it's a lot to say, maybe just get out of the weeds, but I think it is important, because when you're talking about governments doing something about human trafficking, they're setting laws about that. And they have the UK and Australia, they have a Modern Slavery Act. And it also relates to that. Anyway, too much in the weeds there. So how do they define further definitions? We've defined modern slavery, and they divided it up into forced labor and forced marriage. Okay, so under forced labor, they delineate under forced labor exploitation and forced commercial sex exploitation, and that includes adults and children. And so they're not including forced marriage under sexual exploitation, and it's not labor. But they're under forced. So forced labor includes labor and sex, because they're saying sex is like sex work. But when you have forced commercial sex exploitation, that's forced labor. Under forced labor, they also have privately imposed and state imposed. So privately imposed, that's like any company, any corporation, small or big. And then there's the state imposed, which would be like China has state imposed slavery, or North Korea, or some other actors where the state is actually employing workers for their own good, but it's imposed by the state, by the government itself. So a little bit about the data collection. I'm not going to go. They have a whole section in the back. Now this report is like, I don't know how many pages long. How many pages long? Let me look. On my PDF, it's 144 pages, and that's including all the references. But they have a large appendix in the back about data collection and methodology. I quote, "The global estimates presented in this report were developed by the International Labor Organization, Walk Free, and the International Organization for Migration. The estimates are based on a jointly developed methodology summarized in the annex and described in detail in a separate report." So for the forced labor section, they compiled information from surveys of people in 68 nations. And that's about 78,000 respondents. Okay, so out of like 168, about 100 fewer than there are nations in the world. So 78,000 respondents for the forced labor. For the forced marriage estimates, they gathered data from 75 national surveys, so 75 different countries, with nearly 110,000 respondents. So then they, of course, the majority of nations where there were no surveys carried out, they used a new imputation model from which they say this is more accurate than the results in previous years. I don't know. I'm not a statistician, not a mathematician. We'll just take their word for it. But, my points are that Regardless, I'm not saying, I mean, gathering data is super hard. I'm not going to nitpick here. But regardless how rigorous the methodology, developing accurate statistics in global criminal and clandestine phenomena such as human trafficking is really hard. There are millions and millions of people affected. Also, nations, and I didn't look at their survey, but different nations have different definitions, different methods, different indicators of slavery and trafficking. And definitions of slavery and human trafficking can change. They can make it, more strict, wide, and, I mentioned the Palermo Protocol that was developed 22 years ago now. That is suggestion. I mean, that is a suggested definition. Not all the countries actually define human trafficking by that. It was sort of, well, we agreed on and we'll sign on, but the countries are free. They're not beholden to use that particular definition. So a little bit highlights from this report, so I don't bore you too much, but a total of 3.3 million children are in forced labor. That's about 12% of the total number of people in slavery. But of course, it's, talk about clandestine, talk about difficult to survey. So there's, of course, working with children, future other data restraints, ethical restraints, things like that. This is probably the tip of the iceberg. I don't know. Over half of the children in forced labor are in commercial sexual exploitation. Over half. So, we're talking, 1.5, almost 2 million children maybe are in commercial sexual exploitation. That just makes me sick. Interesting port, but I want to make a point about forced child labor. I mean, forced is the key. There's, my time abroad and listening and working in Southeast Asia, there's many kids who are not forced to work, and they do not think it's exploitative for them to be working, even at the expense of school. So, I mean, again, there's so many tangents to go down in this little podcast, but I just want to put a pin in that and want you to think about child labor and whether or not all child labor is exploitative. Well, even if it's not forced, there's some cases, some pretty good arguments to be made that, and different countries have different laws about the definition of child and what we allow them to work. For example, in America, we let kids work, but not at the expense of school. In some respects, anyway, it's just an interesting topic to explore. A note about sexual exploitation of children, forced or not, doesn't matter. I don't care whether the kids think they want to do sex as work. All of it's harmful for children, and it is wrong and should be illegal and should be considered exploitation and trafficking and slavery. Full stop. So another point regarding forced commercial sexual exploitation. I mean, they have to really add a lot of modifiers to sexual exploitation. First of all, it's sexual exploitation, then it's commercial, which means, money is exchanged, and then it's forced to differentiate from other kinds of sex work. But it looks like 6.3 million people are in situations of forced commercial sex at any point in time. 3.9 million people are in state-imposed forced labor at any point in time. 22 million people are in situations of forced marriage on any given day. Let me say that again. On any given day in 2021, 22 million people are in situations of forced marriage. This is an increase. This represents one of the largest percentage increase. This represents a lot of the increase from 2021. That, in 2018, the report said that there were 16 million people in forced marriage. Now they're saying 22 million. That's astounding. on China, they make a special note about China. They mention a couple of the countries, North Korea, Pakistan, whatever. But on they mentioned China several times. I did a search of the PDF. Interesting note, I did not know this. On August 12th of this year, China ratified the ILO, International Labor Organization Forced Labor Convention. This ratification creates a renewed momentum for cooperation with the government and social partners to pursue these issues, to combat forced labor and support human-centered development and decent work. Yay. I don't know. I kind of think they're not going to take it seriously. I don't know. We'll see. But anyway, they signed it. We'll see whether we can actually enforce it, hold their feet to it, whether it, maybe this will say, do these documents even mean anything when nations sign it? I don't know. I mean, the U.S. has signed, I think we signed I think we have not signed like the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Rights of the Child or something. And it's because, well, we won't ratify it because to ratify it means we have to do certain things. I don't know. But anyway, so we'll see. China. Oh, China. So back to another big point. So I went through some of the highlights of the millions of people. One highlight was China and them ratifying the ILO Forced Labor Convention. Another big point about this is that they, because this is a big picture global estimate, and they're trying to find out, well, what is causing 10 million more people to be enslaved over the last 5 years? So the causes, they say, are compounding crises of pandemic, armed conflict, and increases in extreme poverty, unsafe migration, and gender-based violence, aka the patriarchy. That last bit was mine. Also, that modern slavery is overwhelmingly concentrated in the informal economy, where these crises have hit the hardest. Okay, so that last bit, the causes are compounding crises of pandemic, armed conflict, increases in extreme poverty, unsafe migration, and gender-based violence. Also, that modern slavery is overwhelmingly concentrated in the informal economy, where these crises have hit the hardest. I don't disagree with that. To a point. I'll get to this, but I'm going to say it now. I'm going to say it again. Pandemics, climate change, what is unsafe migration? That they do not traffic people. They're creating a background of insecurity that's causing an increase in vulnerabilities for certain humans to take advantage of other humans. Humans traffic people, not, the climate doesn't traffic people. Also, I think something that hit me early on this morning, what I was reading this to review for today is that, the concept, it's overwhelmingly concentrated in the informal economy. So pay attention. This is subtly leading somewhere, because this is all wrapped up in the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. So this is all going somewhere, I promise. And so it finally hit me about why they're going to be using these reports to create crises around these big things, such as, and then we're going to have to do something about the informal economy if we're going to do something about human trafficking. So just pay attention. I'm developing a talk about trafficking and totalitarianism. So little wet your whistle there for that one, because it's going to be very interesting. So big point number 5, the pandemic. So they say, quote, the increase in blah, 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 whatever form of slavery is partially explained by compounding crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic, conflicts, and climate change. Another quote, widespread social and economic instability due to the pandemic led to increased global unemployment, increased indebtedness, and an increase in extreme global poverty for the first time in 2 decades. Another quote, the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic shockwaves, job destruction, and rise in poverty accompanying it have left millions of workers worldwide in situations of heightened vulnerability and their fundamental principles and rights at work at greater risk, and their rights at work at greater risk. Another quote, there were reports in a number of sectors of workers being confined to their workplaces and forced to work excessive hours to compensate for labor shortfalls where the flow of migrant workers was interrupted. Okay, I'm going to say it again. The pandemic does not traffic people. People responded to the pandemic in ways that were harmful to other people. There were much better ways of handling the pandemic. There were much better ways of handling all of these irregular workers, migrants, illegal workers, or for whatever reason. But listen, there are a number of sectors of workers being confined to their workplaces, and they were forced to work excessive hours to compensate for labor shortfalls. So this is where the factories were open, but regular workers couldn't come in, or they couldn't do shifts, or the regular seasonal waves of laborers in and out of countries happens. It was interrupted. So clamp down, shut down. No, we're not going to shut down the factory. We're going to make you work excessive hours. Or the workers were released, and they were in forced labor. They were released. Okay. Now here was the tricky part. Okay, we're shutting down our factory because the government says we have to shut down. We can't work. But how can they get home? Because there's no flights, travel's interrupted, and if they're irregular, they don't have regular papers, whatever, they're trapped where they are. And there's no work, they can't go home, they can't work, and where are they going to stay? Are the workers paying for them? No. I mean, interesting. I had to put a link into what legal prostitution was like in Germany during the shutdown. That was terrible. If you remember that, go back. I forget. Anyway, it's COVID-19 and prostitution in Germany a couple year or so ago. So because people were not allowed to travel back to their homes, domestic workers were trapped in the homes where they stayed. I mean, you couldn't go out, lockdown. Oh man, what happened to them? Horrible things, let me tell you. I know. Fishermen were trapped. They may have been trapped on boats. They're trapped on shore. Can't go anywhere. Here's another quote from the paper. More broadly, COVID-19 created this, not people, not evildoers. The pandemic created a shadow pandemic of violence against women, which some studies have linked to an increase in trafficking. No. Evil people took advantage of a situation where they could inflict more violence against women. And the final quote on this section is, at the same time, the COVID-19 crisis constrained the ability of state and non-state actors to identify and follow up on forced labor cases as resources and attention were diverted to the pandemic response, and lockdowns and mobility restrictions impeded the ability of frontline actors to reach those in need. Yes, so true. This was such a problem, being involved in Europe and on the front lines and working with people on the front lines. Okay, the traffickers, did they care about lockdowns? No. Were they trying to work people? Were they trying to exploit the situation? Were they obediently following lockdown laws and rules and all that? No, but of course organizations were. And so that really was true. The services for aftercare, for identification, for outreach, for legal services, for court cases, for everything, totally shut down and increased. And so everything just got backed up and made it worse for people who were in care. So bad. Okay, so sixth big point, climate change. Of course, climate change is woven into the fabric of this document and is paired with COVID-19, humanitarian conflicts, and gender inequality as a big cause of the increase of people in slavery. Numerous places in the report states that the increase in blah, blah, blah form of slavery is partially explained by compounding crises that, again, including the COVID-19 pandemic, conflicts, and climate change. And there's also, so there's a couple of references. Climate change didn't factor as huge as the pandemic in this report, but it does. And there are big reports I'll go over again about climate change and human trafficking. But a couple of references, and one is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, Gender, and Climate Change. And they have an issues brief. Conservation of nature, gender, and climate change. Okay. Another reference they cite is Climate Justice Resilience Fund, and the title of this article is, quote, Defending Girls' Rights at the Intersection of the Climate Crisis and COVID-19. Oh, the trifecta, gender, climate, and COVID. So you see where this is going. I get really riled up about this. So there's another, stay tuned for a podcast about climate change and human trafficking. And that's just basically, it's going to be a lot of a rant, but I actually am going to have some very solid information about how our current policies, our current interventions to deal with climate for the sake of the people of the world are actually making things worse for impoverished peoples and are increasing vulnerabilities to human trafficking rather than doing something about it to improve their situation. Okay, for another time, shelve it for another time. Big topic number 7, recommendations they list to do. And so a lot of this is of course, we ought to know and do better kind of thing. Rather toothless suggestions because they're not actually, it's all this duh kind of thing with nothing actually gripping, nothing really actionable, nothing particular. Of course, this, you can't be. To be fair, you really can't be. This is a global report. But you'll see some trends. They said that, first point, I agree. Legislation is not in itself sufficient to end forced marriage and needs to be combined with wider preventative approaches in addressing underlying discrimination and gender inequality, as well as related social cultural norms. Yeah, true. This is all messy human stuff, about why there's human trafficking. By the way, when I lived on the top China-North Korea border, that was an issue because there were quite a few men who got their brides from people. Now, sometimes, you could say they were fleeing. I think it was more or less sort of an agreed upon way out, sort of a deal. Okay, women, you don't like life in North Korea? Oh, you want to be a bride. You want to be married to a guy in China because of the gender disparity. 119 boys born for every 100 women, because of their femicide, the infanticide of girls, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's messy. So it's true. So it is, the discrimination against girls in China produced a gender inequality, which fueled the traffic or purchase of women from North Korea, which has its own set of vulnerabilities, into China. Now, of course, you see that also from Burma or Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Northern Thailand. Same deal. All those bordering or near borders with China have the same problem. Okay, I am digressing. So, of course, they want to invest in the building the agency of women and girls. Yes, but this is what they say. They want to invest in building the agency of women and girls. Where do they say invest in building the not just the agency of women and girls about how men let's invest in men and boys in being good men and boys and not mistreating women and girls. Okay, so maybe that's implicit, but there's nothing about really helping men and boys as if we can only help women and girls and men will be men and boys will be boys. I don't know. I mean, you see, like, yeah, agency, but it just assumes that, maybe we need a corollary. In addition to helping women and girls, we also need to help men and boys. Because, yeah, well, women can be traffickers, but it's mostly men. So I'm just pointing out some of the inconsistencies. Okay, another digression. Third point here, third recommendation that I put, there's lots. I'm just picking out the highlights that I want to talk about. This coordination among humanitarian agencies to create pathways for people to safely leave conflict areas and provide livelihood and education opportunities, ensure food security, establish free civil registration services. Okay, yeah, humanitarian crisis. We have to have we have to have services for the people are fleeing. How about reducing the incidences of humanitarian crises? Maybe. I don't know. That one is also complicated. I'm not against that, but it's implying something that I think not every government is really up to doing. Here's the thing that these solutions, these recommendations aren't actually addressing truly root causes. The humanitarian crises are causing irregular migration. They're causing refugees. They're causing people to move around. They're causing, it's creating vulnerabilities for trafficking. But what is behind that? Let's move up. Like, I'm in medicine. Okay, you have a thyroid problem. You have hypertension. Okay, you have diabetes. Not everything. You have like adult onset diabetes. You have obesity. Well, none of these things are really diseases. They're not diseases in themselves. Yeah, sure, we can deal with your thyroid, but while we're dealing with thyroid, let's move upstream and see what's causing your thyroid to react. Maybe it is purely a thyroid issue, but probably, most likely it's not. It's something else. So here's we going. Okay, so let's deal with this. Why do we have a problem with women and girls, for example? What's the root cause of that? Okay, so these issues, the pandemic, the climate change, humanitarian crisis, gender-based violence, these are nameless, faceless, personless concepts that we are all against but can't be made accountable or held responsible like real people. We really need to get a lot more granular. For prevention and for true interventions, we have to look at these individuals. And yes, it's a broad painting with broad strokes, but still really need to start here and then get more granular in your nation, in your state, in your province, in your city, in your region, in your area, in your community. People traffic and enslave people. I said this before. People fail to make or enforce laws by which people are held accountable. Okay? So when someone breaks law, we need to hold them accountable, but you're not going to prosecute your way out of human trafficking. You're not going to rescue your way out of human trafficking. You're not going to pandemic proof your way out of human trafficking. You're not going to like solve climate change and prevent human trafficking. You can solve climate change, and that's not going to prevent human trafficking. You can even arrest all the Jeffrey Epsteins and Ghislaine Maxwell's in the world. You're not going to stop human trafficking either. So, you know, a lot of they're just toothless. So, anyway, I'm going back to my heart. My passion is prevention, true prevention. All these are secondary prevention strategies. The rescue and the prosecution and all that, and helping women and children. Well, yeah, that's great. We really need to get more granular than that. So that's it for that report. Hopefully it's not boring. This is, like I said, 144-page report. Lots of stats, lots of graphs and stuff. Maybe I'll actually get a thumbnail because I'll just pinch one from the PDF. But you have to go to walkfree.org, and you'll have the reports and global estimates of modern slavery 2022. The link will be in the show notes if you want to have a look. And if you're having trouble sleeping, go for it. So I think that's long. This is long enough. All right. I'll skip the other thing I was going to talk about. Some EU proposed forced labor ban. Maybe when I need material for the next time. But I wanted to talk to you because if you haven't seen this, you really should. So this little section is a little comedic. Like I said, modern slavery is not very funny, but it is funny when someone gets schooled. So Don Lemon of CNN recently got schooled on this by royal historian Hilary Fordwich. And so Don Lemon, on a show in CNN, he suggested, he's talking with Miss or Dr., I'm not really sure, Fordwich, about, okay, let's talk about slavery. Let's talk about, King Charles III now and what they're going to do with the Commonwealth and former colonized colonies. And he suggests that Great Britain, and especially the royal family, pay reparations to descendants of the slaves by Britain. But the scholar, Miss Hilary Fordwich, very English name, puts him right back in school, very calm and forthright. And you really just have to watch this for yourself. It's about a minute and a half to 2 minutes long. It's classic. And then I'll put another. So he just has no idea what to say in response to her reply, which is just very classy. Also, the Not the Bee did an article about this, and they have a long. There's actually a longer version of. No, I should say. Newsmax. Sorry. I'll post several articles where you can watch the brief version. Newsmax TV did a longer takedown and a longer interview with Fordwich about that interaction, and you'll learn something about slavery too, and slavery in Africa, something that I had heard about but didn't really realize the details of it. Very interesting, and so I hope you are entertained by this, but also you'll learn something. So thank you for paying attention. Now we're going on 40 minutes, and have a spectacular week. And let me know what you think in the comments or email, or reach out to me on the website, however you want to do. And we'll talk to you next week. Bye.